Okay, in lesson 2, we're going to go into a few more art and graphic design movements. So we flew through the past really quickly from 35,000 BC up into about the 1600s. And so now we're going to go from there up into about the mid 1900s. And we're going to see some different movements, probably things you're more familiar with, things you've seen in museums or seen in movies or art history classes, things like that. So we're going to look at some of those art movements that you've been more familiar with. First one we're going to talk about is the Victorian era. In the Victorian era, it's a period searching for a style. They're looking for something. They couldn't quite figure out what they want to do. And you can see from these examples, there's 4 different ones. They all kind of have their own little look and feel to them, but they all have a Victorian style, which is very kind of ornate. It was very, how do you say, like kind of decorative, floral. You can kind of see that in the Micah, North Carolina poster, right? You get these like cool little decorative swirls and designs. And even the one on the far left, you got this really ornate border. So a lot of that stuff started to grow through the Victorian era, trying to sift through it and figure out what their actual style was. Lithography was created during this era too in 1796. So this allowed for a design language to start to grow a little bit, and then you can do more complex designs. Those 3 on the bottom there are very, very complex designs that you couldn't really do through the standard printing press with multiple colors. So the lithograph was really a cool invention on how to create more colors and get these large scale prints. Lithography was invented by this man named Sennefelder, and he was in Bavaria, very small little country in Europe there. So what they do is they draw an image on a flat stone with an oil-based crayon, and then they apply water to it and then an oil-based ink. And so what happens is the oil and water, they repel each other, and the ink adheres to the drawing and it's repelled by the water. So the paper is applied to it and then it's printed on there. So it seems like a pretty simple process, and it is, but there's some definitely complexities to it. But using oil and water to repel each other and then print it onto the paper. So it's a pretty cool process. Maybe we'll put a video on there, show you down the road how that lithography process works, which is really cool. But in this era as well, you had this rise in magazines and advertisements. So because they could do full colors or multicolors, the advertisement world started to grow a little bit. Magazines started to be more colorful, and they started to become a more popular item. Then came the arts and crafts movement. So what they were doing is they kind of, you see this in art a lot, of people kind of go one direction, and then all of a sudden there's this urge to go back to an older style. Like we've kind of lost the heart and soul of why we do what we do. So with the printing and lithography coming, it started to seem too mechanical. So this group wanted to go back to the old way of doing things, which is kind of getting back with your hands and hand drawing things and embellishments. So this arts and crafts movement kind of rises up a little bit. So they go back to that hand-drawn creating things. So handmade illustrations and products. They didn't like the industrialization of print. And then you have what's called the Clem Scott Press. It was created to recapture the beauty of those Inconnubible books that we saw in the early German books, right? That detailed design and craft. So they're trying to get back to that a little bit. And what's interesting is we actually kind of see that in our world today, where graphic design and technology started to come out, and you have Illustrator and Photoshop and all these cool things, and everything seemed kind of mechanical. And now in the last 5 to 10 years or so, there's this real draw back to hand-drawn lettering, very Victorian style, heritage style script fonts, and very kind of etched looking or like lithograph or like wood carving prints. So that look and feel is really desired by people, because we almost got, again, too industrial. So we go back to the handcrafted look. So this happened back in the 1800s, and it's happening even now in our own generation. And then you have what's called Art Nouveau. It's an internationally decorative style. So they have these organic linear movements and lines and real big colors and textures. It became kind of the initial phase of the modern art movement. But you can see it was kind of at the turn of the century, 1890 to 1910 is when you have Art Nouveau. So it didn't last very long, but it is a very long-lasting art movement that people still use and kind of mimic and replicate today. So with Muka, he is one of the artists from this era, and he used his theme was kind of a central female figure that was very elongated. So you can see on the far right there that poster of this female figure centered, very elongated, very stretched out kind of feel to it. And he was kind of inspired by what was known as the Byzantine Empire. So that was kind of a Middle Eastern culture, and they had very decorative, ornate styles and designs to their buildings and structures and their fabrics and their textiles. So he kind of brought that in there. So as we sit here and learn about art history, we learned that even these artists pulled on history and culture to inspire their own work. So it's this cyclical process of looking at other cultures and what they do, and then saying, how can I synthesize that or reimagine it to my own time period, to my own style, to my own look, and what I want to communicate? It wasn't copying what they did, but it was taking the essence of the idea behind it, how they put it together, and making it their own. And that's really what we as artists and creative people want to do. All right, so we went through a couple of these really quickly, and what we're going to do is we're going to pause right here. So you're going to pause this video, and you're going to go back to Canvas, and there's going to be a Padlet there for you, and you're going to answer this question. List as many similarities as you can think of from these three art movements. They're all a little bit different, but what are the similarities that you see? If you need to go back in the video and look at the examples, you can do that as well, but you'll go into Canvas, there's a Padlet there, and you'll answer this question there. All right, now we're going to talk about 20th century design. So now we're getting into the late 1900s, or late 1800s, early 1900s in our design. So right after that Art Nouveau movement, we start to see 20th century design coming through. First one we're looking at is the Glasgow School. So that was about 1900, and they used a lot of symbolic imagery and stylized forms. So when we say stylized, for example, if you look at the picture on the right, you can tell those are human figures, but you can also tell that the proportions are off a little bit. Those arms are a little bit too thin, maybe a little long, and the body is stretched out way farther than it actually is. So that's what stylized means. It's, you recognize it as a real thing, but it's drawn in a way that's not necessarily realistic. It's exaggerated a little bit. So they really kind of pulled on that stylized form in their ideas. And their ideas are bold, simple lines defined by flat planes. So they got rid of the three-dimensional feel of things, and they used flat colors, flat shapes to represent theirs. And then you can see the bold colors that Glasgow School Institute, right? The black background with the white and the gold, very bold colors, great contrast. Even that Macintosh cover, you've got bold colors with the big M and the A, and then flat shapes. Even though they overlap, it's still very flat shapes. It has a very flat style and feel to it. And you have the Vienna secession. So this is in Vienna, Austria around the 1900s. So they were transitioning from a symbolist style to more of a floral design. So now you kind of switch over a little bit. You kind of see how there is a Art Nouveau feel to them with the kind of ornateness and the elongating of things, the floral feel to it, but it's starting to transition a little bit into something different and unique. So that's what we're kind of looking at here. So they have a combination of mathematical squares and rectangles with circular forms and letter forms. So they kind of combined the rigid mathematical squares and rectangles with the more fluid curved lines of circles and letter forms and curved lines. So that's kind of where they went with it. And they love to use a lot of empty space. If you look at this part, this design over here, a lot of empty space. The S has come down really far and just leave a lot of empty space. A lot of empty space. I say empty, but really, I mean, you can see there's pattern designs there going on. It's that white space that we talk about, or we will talk about in graphic design, but using it in a way where it allows the design to breathe, but still looks balanced and intentional. It's not just blank for no reason. Now we're talking about modern art influence. So what are those influences that came along that influenced everything in the modern art that we see today? So the first one is Cubism. And you guys might know Pablo Picasso's very known for Cubism, and it was inspired by African art. So just like before with that, the artist Mucha in the Art Nouveau style was inspired by Byzantine art. Pablo Picasso was inspired by African art. He loved the way they used their figures. They elongated the figures, stylized the figures to represent certain meanings in life. And so he treated nature in terms of cylinders, spheres, and cones. So if any of you have taken a drawing class, the 4 basic geometric forms, 3-dimensional forms, are cylinder, cube, cone, and a sphere. So everything can be broken down into those 4 things. They add those together to make more complex forms. So what he did is he took these complex forms that were realistic and broke them down, sometimes into flat planes, sometimes into 3-dimensional planes. Then you've got futurism, and this is where they used words as images. This is really fun. This is really challenging for someone like me to think like this and to create like this, but I really appreciate and respect this kind of art, because to create something like that that uses letters as a visual form is really cool. Pattern poetry is another name for it as well too. You can look at that, or that was created in the futurism style. And the Manifesto by Filippo Tommaso Marinetti. He was an Italian poet, but this is his example right there of creating pattern poetry. So his words, but used in a very visual way. It's a very unique style. Then we have Dadaism, and that was in the 1920s. And Dadaism was anti-art. They had this idea that art was getting away from the people, was becoming elitist. So they had very strong negative and destructive elements to their work. It was a lot of shock and protest and nonsense in their work. So some of the things they created absolutely made no sense whatsoever. And that was kind of the point of it. They wanted to rebel against the horrors of war and the shallowness of like just believing in technology, because they were seeing the horrors of technology. Like example there with Adolf Hitler and some of the things they saw with World War I. So people were just believing in technology, and they were kind of like, hey, we need to back up a little bit here because we're giving into it too much and it's causing a lot of death and destruction. So it was kind of a protest type art movement. So we see a lot of that nowadays too, of using your voice, your creative voice, to bring attention to something. And then we move into surrealism. So it's more real than the real world is what these surrealist artists would have said. So Salvador Dali is the more famous surrealist artist. You guys have probably seen The Melting Clocks. That's one of his works. It's naturalist in the imagery, but it's dreamlike in its creation and concept. So again, you can see there's natural figures there, the hand, the people, but how they're depicted is very weird and very interesting, very dreamlike, and it's not realistic as what we'd see in the actual world. So that's what Salvador Dali said he was doing, was he was painting his dreams. So we're going to take a quick pit stop here, and you're going to kind of answer this little question. It says there's a huge transition in style and purpose of art in this era. And you can see from surrealism to Dadaism, from the Victorian era, how that kind of changed. It's pretty wild. It's pretty rapid. So review your notes and write down 2 or 3 key points about the change in style and purpose. And then paraphrase these key points in your own words. You're going to write down the paraphrased part in the discussion board in Canvas. So if you go to Canvas and you see it says like lesson 2 paraphrase, that's where you're going to put that together. And I'll copy and paste that. It'll be in there for you as well to look at. So go ahead and pause the video right here and go ahead and write that answer down. And we're going to move on to the next phase of this. And this one is called pictorial modernism. So Bernhard was kind of the father of pictorial modernism. It had a lot of Japanese influence in his style with the really bold shapes and the radical simplification. So he took these ideas, these objects, and just tried to simplify them down to the bare essence, like basic shapes, basic colors, very bold and very flat. So you can see that typewriter. You can tell it's a 3-dimensional typewriter, but it's made with very flat shapes and colors. And then he also invented a typeface called the Bernhard typeface. One of the other forms of art and graphic design that came out of this era was war posters. So it started in the Victorian era of using advertisements and posters, and then with technology increasing And then with the wars coming on, you had the ability to make and mass produce posters to communicate a message. They were simple, they were powerful, and they used basic shapes and naturalistic images. Obviously the very iconic Uncle Sam, I want you for the U.S. Army. And then the Britons had one too. I'm not sure who that man is, but it's almost the exact same concept that the U.S. had. And then you've got the German U-boat poster, like join the U-boat crew and sink ships. But again, very simple designs, very bold shapes, clear message. That's what a really effective poster design is. It's not very detailed and tons of information going on. A really great poster will grab your attention, communicate something quickly through a few words and some images. Ludwig Holbein of Munich created the early war poster in the style of Bernard. So Bernard was that, when we just saw the pictorial modernism, he took his style and turned that into those war posters. So you can see how he's influenced and created something new from that. And then we get into Art Deco, the 1920s and 1930s. When you think of Art Deco, you think of the Roaring Twenties. What am I thinking of? The Great Gatsby. There you go. That's what you'd think of when you think of Art Deco. So it was in between the World War I and World War II, very geometric styles, and the major aesthetic in graphics, architecture, and product design. So you can see a lot of their stuff was very architectural, very linear, very geometric in their style, very clean work too. Even the letter forms. The Metropolis, not so much, but if you look at the Chicago World's Fair, even the part at the bottom there, you can see it's very geometric, very linear in its look and feel. And then you have, I think, one of my favorite unique art movements is Russian constructivism. This is between the 1920s and 30s as well. It's in between the wars, but it's common traits of cubism and futurism. So you've got these Russian artists that are taking these two styles that are out there and kind of combining them together, which is really interesting. And they experimented with typography. Like, how could type be manipulated and used, maybe broken up a little bit, and type itself be made into shapes and still communicate the idea? So really cool concepts. It included the mathematical and structural properties of architect Elizitsky. So they took those architectural mathematical concepts, combine it with some cubism, futurism ideas, some big bold colors and outlines and shapes, and you create these really cool Russian constructivist type things. It was developed when Russia was torn apart in between the wars, and the movement was accelerated by the revolution and the transition into kind of a propaganda effort. So once this design was created, all of a sudden it took over and it started to become, a propaganda tool by the Russians. Der Stil is how it's pronounced. It's in the 1920s and 30s as well. It's so fascinating, isn't it, that all these different movements are occurring at the same time, but in different parts of the world. Some of it's in Europe, some of it's in Russia, and this was in the Netherlands. So Piet Mondrian is the most famous artist from this movement, and that's his work on the far right. And he used primary colors, red, yellow, blue, and black and white. So working in abstract geometric styles, they wanted harmony and equilibrium for the arts. So their abstract stuff didn't represent anything. It was more about harmony and balance and equilibrium. And de Stil actually means the style, is what that stands for. That's what it means in, is it Dutch, the Netherlands? I think they speak Dutch, yeah. So they hoped their harmony and their artwork would be a prototype of a new social order. So again, there's this really interesting motivation in art in the 1920s and 30s after World War I, that they wanted to use art for a purpose. Unfortunately, some people used it for a negative purpose, for propaganda posters. In Russia, they kind of took it a little bit and used it for propaganda for the war. And some people, like these people, Piet Mondrian, they used it to try to bring a harmonious social order into the world. So people were trying to use their art to create change. And that still exists today, where people create art to make change. So it's always been a part of the art world. And the Bauhaus movement. The Bauhaus movement was kind of short-lived. It got cut off actually by World War II. It was 1920s in Germany. So again, another country, same time period. But they, again, were characterized by a utopian desire to create a new spiritual society. So after World War I, their country was torn apart a little bit. They wanted to bring it back together. And so their whole idea, kind of like de Stil, was to show a new spiritual society, harmony, bringing everything together. So artists and craftsmen would build the future. So they wanted to combine the visual arts and crafts and architecture and bring it all together. Advanced ideas about form and color and space. Even though it was short-lived, it had a very long-lasting impact. People still talk about the Bauhaus movement today. People still study it and create work based on their ideas. The reason it was short-lived is because the Nazis in World War II actually shut down the school that they had created. So it wasn't even allowed to move on because of that. But the Bauhaus school itself, the building, still exists, and you can go visit that today in Germany. All right. So to wrap this up, there's a reflection page that you're going to go to in Canvas, and you're going to answer these questions right here. It says, did you write down any of the movements we learned in class today? If so, which ones did you write down? And which of the movements that we learned today seemed the most interesting to you? You know what? I'm going to scratch that first question. That did you write down? We'll leave that out. I want you just to focus on the second one. Which of the movements that we learned today seemed the most interesting to you? And explain your answer. I'd love to know what you guys found the most interesting and why you liked it. And remember, as we're going through this, make a note in your sketchbook or on your notes page of what sticks out to you, because that could be something that you kind of maybe study a little bit more, read about, dig into, and just pull a few things away from that and incorporate it into your own work down the road. That's going to help you learn and grow in your graphic design skills. So that's it for this lesson today. We'll see you next time.